for the introduction. So as mentioned, my name is Kylie Stewart. I am from Denver, Colorado. I work at a company called Formidable. We are a JavaScript consultancy that's based in Seattle. We have offices in Denver, Phoenix, and we're trying to grow. So feel free to talk to me about Formidable after this if you want to, but I'm going to get into my talk. So React to React Native, how hard could it be? My goal here is really just to show you what the main differences between these two frameworks are. I probably should have done my intro second. The difference between these two frameworks and also the similarities. And hopefully going to answer the question, why would I bother writing a presentation in React, or not a presentation, geez. So what is React? React is a JavaScript framework for creating UIs. So it's open source, owned by Facebook. If you're not familiar, a lot of people are using it. So it was created and maintained by Facebook, but it is open source. You can look at the roadmap, and it's always being updated. We have a lot of new features every year, and that's just a high-level overview if you're not familiar. So why is it cool? So it's JavaScript to make UIs. You get the best of both worlds if you like JavaScript, that is. I'm assuming if you're here, you do. You get to stay in your comfort zone with that. So it's also open source. As I mentioned with Facebook, you do get to contribute to the library if you want to. You have an eyesight of what's ahead. JSX is the other key feature of React. It's JavaScript to make your UIs, so you can use JSX with these HTML elements to render to your virtual DOM. So it's meant to be an easier way to manipulate these HTML maneuvers when you're building your UIs, and then you have these component interfaces. So everything down to the very bottom is essentially a function or a component that's an extension of the React class. And these interfaces that you define of props that are being passed in and the state that it's going to maintain help you better visualize and isolate certain concerns. I'm not going to get into the architecture of how you might want to build a React application, but there's a lot more to be said there. So what is React Native? React Native is React made for native applications. So it's native-like. It's not necessarily a full-on native program like Kotlin, but it is essentially a native bridge that will help bridge the gap between JavaScript and the actual native code. The difficulty is mapping those HTML elements to their native elements in whatever that device might be. So the notch on the iPhone, for example, that is a consideration that every mobile app developer had to deal with when it first came out. And that's something that was native to the phone, not something you could override in your UI. You're not dealing with the browser, you're dealing with a phone that has very different features. So it was also created and maintained by Facebook. I would say the open source community kind of holds this one up right now. Facebook hasn't, well, they're working on a rewrite, which I'll get into more, but the open source community is a lot more leaned on for React Native development, which could be good or bad, I guess. It's up for discussion. So the dream is to build once, deploy anywhere. So ideally, if you can just build your components in React and then just bridge it on over to React Native, you can deploy a mobile app, Android app, iOS app, and then you have your beautiful website and everything works perfectly. So that's the dream. Not necessarily exactly how it's going to work, but this is definitely the intention with React Native. So how hard could it actually be? There was a GIF here. It's gone now. This software, it was written in React as well. So just a high-level comparison of how do you get started with a React application. I mean, it's easy as npx create React app. You make an app, you go in, you can start. There's a lot more to be said about what happens after this, but just getting started with a brand new React application is quite easy, and the same is said for React Native. You can use, there is a CRA for native, so CRNA, and you can use that to get started as well. But, so we're going to get into the challenges. The biggest difficulties between these two programs, so your code in React and your code in React Native, different syntax entirely. So instead of divs, you're dealing with views. And instead of buttons, we're dealing with touchables. Instead of clicks, we're dealing with presses. It's shifting the entire way you're thinking about these interfaces to focus on mobile, on the user experience, on these native bindings. So instead of a click like you would have in a browser, you have to just restructure what kind of behavior you want your components to have, because the user interface is going to be very different, and the way that they scroll through, click through, tab through, all very different considerations. Not quite as easy to just throw a hamburger menu in it. So the second challenge is going to be styling. It's inline styles all the way down. So you're going to be using CSS in JS, which leads a lot of people to end up using styled components for a lot of their very specific styling. Everything's in Flexbox just already. That's also in line with your elements in React Native. Turns into, I don't know if everyone, I know at least at my company, we use styled components a lot for most of our browser UIs. It's a really common approach that we take to styling very specific things. So to do this in React Native is not that big of a jump because it's something that I'm already used to as a pattern. I do know some of the teams we've consulted with very unfamiliar with CSS and JS, and this is like the last thing in the world they want to do. You don't have options in React Native is what this is to say. It's a lot more difficult to get, you just have to change the way you're thinking about it. It's the same as the touchables, the divs. It's reframing the way that you're thinking about your application for a user. So the user experience can be similar, but it's not going to be exactly the same. Another challenge, there's no more local storage. It's now async storage, and it is even more difficult to work with. It's not the easiest thing to do, to deal with. I've had a lot of issues with infrastructure. I remember my first React Native app just like could not figure out where to put the secrets that weren't going to just be out in the open. And that's still a problem. There are a lot of people that are putting high-value items in async storage that really shouldn't be there. It is important to note that again, everything's a little bit different. It's just a one-off, and you're going to have to restructure the way that you think about that. Offline accessibility is paramount for mobile devices. You really don't want to forget that they're often, well, at least I often don't have service. I often am in dark patches of no service, and I don't want to totally lose access to a Maps app or some other kind of functionality that would be important to me. So offline accessibility is really, really key. When we're thinking about the browser and the user's experience in the browser, pretty sure we're all visualizing somebody either clicking on their phone or sitting at a desk. It's not usually that they're looking for your website out in the wild. So offline accessibility is a consideration that really needs to be kind of first and foremost in your infrastructure and the way that you're thinking about developing the app. And then the App Store is going to be its own battle. And this kind of leads you into the discussion of what is worth putting into an app and what's going to be worth just wrapping an Ionic, having an existing React application, and then just having it shipped as basically a really aggressive PWA. Because that can happen. I have a very high-level client right now who's doing that with a large food delivery system. And it's just an Ionic application that's meant to be a mobile application. I would personally say that's not the best case when you're dealing with money and location and things that you really want to be tied to the device and things that are a lot more native. You really probably do want to make an actual React Native app. So you have these native bridges and you actually are interacting with the phone and the device in the correct way. At the end of the day, between Ionic and these other PWA native bridges, it's about performance. They're not going to be the fastest. They're not going to be the best because they aren't natively bound to your device. But they still work. They're still great. If you just have an informational site, it's very worth your while to have that React application, throw it in Ionic, and then ship it because that's going to be just fine. But yeah, for like a food delivery service, I definitely recommend going full native because you want everything that the phone is going to need. So when I'm talking about these native bindings, I'm not going to show you a bunch of the bridged out code because that's not really even worth reading. But the important takeaway here, you're going to be addressing Android and iOS separately. And that's kind of a pain. You end up having to, there are going to be some points where a component's working in iOS and it's not working in Android or vice versa. And handling the native bindings in these separate files that are declared and then exported helps with the bridge, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about the bridge. So the future of React Native itself is Fabric. I'm not sure if anyone is staying super in the loop on their blog posts lately, but Fabric was announced last year, October 2018. It's 2019, right? So Fabric was released. It's not released. It's a rewrite of the library, and it's going to have 3 main goals. brand new threading model, async rendering, and then a simplified native bridge. Right now, because we have to declare these iOS, Android files to handle just like a very specific Kotlin native binding to that one device, apparently it's going to be easier. So I'm really curious to see what that's going to look like. I haven't seen samples of how it's going to improve, but it is going to improve. So that's something to look forward to. And again, since it is open source, it's something that's always going to be, available. Trying to get my, okay. So, and since it's open source, we can always go and look at the roadmap. So their vision for React Native in the future is actually maintaining a healthy ecosystem, essentially. It's what all of this sums to say. My experience with React Native, especially working with clients, has been it's broken, and it's broken often. Updating is hard. Updating a major version is even harder. And it's just difficult. There's been unstable APIs. You realize you've been leaning on this one thing, and it's being taken away as soon as you update. It wasn't great. So they've noticed that. They've apparently had some kind of internal reflection and said that this is going to be their intended future. So with this rewrite and with these stated goals, I feel pretty confident that it is going to get simpler to work from React to React Native. Right now, it's a matter of picking which way you want to go. So with that, do you have any questions?